They are tiny. Some are barely larger than a basketball court. They have no cities, no people, no ancient ruins. But these islands, or reefs, really, have become the center of one of the most dangerous standoffs on Earth. You probably know about it, the war between China and Taiwan. But this crisis isn't brewing in Taiwan itself. Instead, it's happening around here, the South China Sea, a place where war has not been declared but never ends. Where ships circle islands that didn't exist a decade ago. And where trillions of dollars in trade, national pride, and military power all collide silently every single day. This is the longest-running war you've never heard of. This is the South China Sea. I'm the host. Let's dive in. We'll start with a quick geography lesson. The South China Sea stretches across 3.5 million square kilometers, touching the coasts of China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. It's more than just water. Over 1/3 of global trade passes through it. It holds vast oil and natural gas reserves beneath the seabed, and it's rich in fishing zones that millions rely on for survival. But it's also filled with over 200 islands, reefs, and shoals, most of which are uninhabitable or even submerged at high tide. So why do so many countries claim all of this empty ocean? Back in 1947, China drew a map, and it was hand-sketched, vague, and based on ancient imperial charts. That map included a U-shaped boundary called the Nine-Dash Line, claiming almost the entire South China Sea as Chinese territory. The problem? Other countries, especially Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, claimed many of those same islands and waters under modern international law. Why? Because they're closer to those islands than China. Now, if you zoom into this map, you'll see why this matters. The sea contains two major groups of islands, the Paracel Islands in the north and the Spratly Islands in the south. The Paracels are controlled entirely by China, after they seized them from South Vietnam in 1974. They also control almost all of the surrounding waters. Vietnam still claims them, though, and frequent naval confrontations are reported. Further south are the Spratlys. These islands are the actual hotspot. They're claimed in part by 6 different countries. 3 of them have occupied features: China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The others have smaller outposts, while 2 have none at all. First, there are 2 main reasons why these islands are so important. Reason no. 1. They're sitting on a literal goldmine of oil and natural gas. Recent surveys suggest that there could be up to 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas beneath the seabed. That's worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Reason number 2. Control the shipping lanes. Every day, thousands of cargo ships pass through the South China Sea, carrying almost $5 trillion worth of goods. That includes half of China's oil imports. So whoever controls the islands essentially controls the sea. And that means they can monitor and tax all of the shipping. But there's another reason too, a less practical and more emotional one: national pride and security. For centuries, Chinese emperors considered the South China Sea part of their empire. Ancient charts recorded the presence of fishermen and sailors from Fujian province. The Paracels were even mentioned in a 15th century Ming Dynasty novel. So the idea of losing these islands to foreign powers would be a major blow to Chinese pride. Plus, in an increasingly multipolar world, controlling the South China Sea gives China a big boost in military power. The U.S. Navy regularly patrols the region to keep trade open and balance Chinese power. But if China controls the islands, then America won't be able to do that anymore. Okay, so we know what's at stake. But how did we get here? Who owns the islands? Well, despite the presence of various indigenous communities, no one lived on these islands until the 20th century. They were basically uninhabited. Then in 1946, right before the end of World War II, the Japanese surrendered their occupation of the Paracels. The Vietnamese returned to find them abandoned and in ruins. So they retook the islands, administered them as part of South Vietnam, then gave them to North Vietnam in 1958. At that point, China took notice. They had surveyed the area decades before, and based on their old charts, they decided to reclaim the Paracels and the rest of the 9-dash line. So in 1974, they sent in warships to fight South Vietnam. After a month of fighting, China occupied the Paracels, and Vietnam hasn't tried to retake them since. Next, let's look at the Spratly Islands. Here's where things get really complicated, because there are 7 claimants here, each with their own justifications based on history, geography, and international law. Malaysia claims these islands. China claims these ones. Vietnam claims these ones. The Philippines claims these 3. Taiwan claims this one, and Brunei claims a bit of everything. Now you can probably guess why this conflict is still ongoing. Each country wants to assert their sovereignty, and they're not willing to compromise because they don't trust each other. China doesn't trust Vietnam. Vietnam doesn't trust the Philippines, and no one trusts Malaysia. So who actually occupies these islands today? Well, only 5 countries have established a significant presence: China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan. Most of these outposts began as fishing stations, supplying food and shelter for local fishermen. But over time, they grew into full-blown military bases. They've been reinforced with airstrips, missile systems, radar towers, and deep ports. They have the capacity to house thousands of troops, store weapons, launch fighter jets, and track ships passing nearby. It's like the military version of whack-a-mole. For every outpost that another country builds, China reclaims more land, reinforcing its own position. But wait, there's more. In 2013, China began an aggressive campaign of land reclamation. They dredged sand and rock from the seafloor and used it to build artificial islands. Since then, they've added over 3,000 acres of new land, enough space to park 3 American aircraft carriers. 3 of these islands are fully operational military bases, and the others will follow soon. Okay, so we understand the history and the stakes. But how does this conflict play out in reality? What actually happens? Well, technically, nothing. There has been no official war, no formal hostilities, and no large-scale violence. But that might change in the coming years, because there are signs that tensions are rising. This war is being fought quietly, silently. For starters, there are regular reports of shadowing, laser targeting, and dangerous close calls between ships. The U.S. Navy routinely conducts freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships close to the islands to assert innocent passage. But China always responds with radio warnings and escorting destroyers. Sometimes they turn off their transponders to hide their location. They block communications with jamming equipment and use military vessels to block and shadow reconnaissance planes. There are also numerous reports of fishing boat collisions, submarine detection operations, and dangerous airspace warnings. Just last week, a Philippine boat accused a Chinese Coast Guard vessel of blocking their route and ramming their fishing boats. But if there's no fighting, then who's winning? Well, it depends on how you define victory. If it's about military power, then China is clearly winning. They've built more bases, deployed more ships, and asserted their dominance in the Paracels. The Philippines has stepped up their own efforts. They've spent billions of dollars upgrading their military and conducting joint exercises with the United States. The result is a stalemate. Despite all the posturing and saber-rattling, no one dares make the first move. China knows that starting a war would risk escalation and possibly nuclear exchange, and no one else wants to risk provoking China. Still, some scholars argue that this is not a stable situation. The risk of miscalculation is too high. Any small incident could trigger a wider conflict. In fact, there's a theory that this is exactly what China wants. By driving away other countries, Beijing might force the U.S. to make a choice. Do they intervene and risk war? Or do they accept the loss of the South China Sea? Either way, China wins. So what's the solution? Can this ever be solved? Well, officially, yes. There are frameworks and agreements in place to resolve this crisis. For example, the Philippines filed a case against China at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The court ruled that China's 9-dash line has no legal basis. The sea belongs to everyone under UNCLOS, but China refused to accept the ruling. They simply ignored it and continued building. Right now, diplomacy is struggling to make progress. On one side are the ASEAN states, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This includes the countries with competing claims: Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and others. Their priority is stability and peaceful coexistence. On the other side is China. Their priority is national pride and security. For decades, ASEAN and China have held annual summits and agreed to a series of vaguely worded principles: non-interference, mutual trust, sovereign equality. But none of these principles address the core issue: the conflicting claims. As a result, tensions continue to rise. ASEAN and China signed a code of conduct in 2021. It establishes rules for behavior in the South China Sea, including avoiding dangerous or provocative actions and seeking peaceful resolutions. But it's not been enforced yet. Both sides are still negotiating the details, and China refuses to accept any outside monitoring. Okay, so we know the history, the stakes, and the current state of play. First, there's the economy. Trillions of dollars in trade pass through the South China Sea every year. Almost half of China's oil imports pass through this area, along with vital shipments from other countries. A conflict here would disrupt global supply chains and spike inflation worldwide. Second, there's the environment. The South China Sea is one of the most diverse marine ecosystems on Earth. It's home to endangered species, coral reefs, fishing grounds. But all of that could be destroyed by a war. Oil spills, sinking ships, plastic waste, and radioactive contamination would poison the water and decimate local wildlife. Third, there's the military. Conflict in the South China Sea would drag in regional powers, especially the United States, China's biggest rival. They could deploy aircraft carriers, submarines, and fighter jets. And if tensions escalated, that could lead to direct confrontation between nuclear powers. The bottom line: a war here could quickly turn into a disaster for the entire planet. And that's it. The disputed islands of the South China Sea. There are so many stories like this that go under the radar, but shape our world in big ways. The key to understanding world politics is knowing where to look. That's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. See you next time.